Welcome to Title Talks, the show where you can spend some time with the most influential people in the title industry while they share their insight on everything from making your operation more efficient to the latest technology, sales and marketing strategies, hot topics, and more. Take a minute to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you're already subscribed, be sure to rate and review our show. It really helps us out. This week, we're talking about the history of racial covenants or racially restrictive covenants and their impacts on housing and our communities today. Kirsten Delegard is a historian who heads up the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota. Anyone a golden gopher out there? She's with us this week to share more about the importance of identifying these covenants and how land title professionals like you may be able to help. I'm Lindsay Gordon, and this is Title Talks. Thank you so much for joining us, Kirsten. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk a little bit about the Mapping Prejudice Project. So why don't you tell people who you are and what it is that you do?
So my name is Kirsten Delegard, and I am one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project. We're based at the University of Minnesota Libraries, and we work with community members to identify and map racial covenants.
Okay, so explain what a racial, is it a racial covenant, a racially restrictive covenant? Is that the same thing? Explain what those are.
Yeah, that's a race, racially restrictive deed. So racial covenants are clauses that are inserted into property records to prevent people who are seen as not white, and that's not always clear cut, like who's white and who's not, from buying or even occupying certain pieces of land. And racial covenants were extremely common through most of the 20th century. They were, and we can talk about where they came from and who promoted them. But there's no community across the United States that does not have racial covenants in its property records.
Wow. That's what I was going to ask. Is it more like an issue in the South? Is it like it's everywhere?
It's everywhere. There's there's more than 3,000 counties across the United States, and whenever anyone has gone looking for racial covenants, they have found them. They're not limited to urban areas. They're in rural areas. And I know the listeners of this podcast who work with property records will be able to affirm this. This is one of the places, one of the communities that we have learned the most about racial covenants, because until really recently, they've been really hard to study. And so it's the people who work with the records all the time who have really been able to educate us about how covenants worked and how you find them and where they are.
Yeah, so let's then, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about like the genesis of this and like where, racially restrictive covenants came from and like how old are they, how recent are there, ones that exist in terms of like when they were implemented. Yeah.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about myself, so that it will give you a sense of how I came to this subject. So I'm trained as a historian. I grew up in Minneapolis, and then I left when I was 18, and I was gone for many years. And when my kids were little, my husband and I decided that we wanted to return to my hometown. And it was that returning home that really gave me a fresh lens on my hometown. And one of the things that was very stark for me when I returned to Minneapolis is grappling with the fact that the city had some of the highest racial disparities in the country. So I was really interested in using my skills as a historian to understand how that developed, and why Minneapolis was different from other cities and what were the factors that went into that. So that sent me on a quest to understand the city's history. And one of the things that kept coming up was racial covenants, that people talked about how prevalent they were. And I had never heard of racial covenants before doing this work. even though I'm a historian. So I started asking people questions about, how many racial covenants are there in Minneapolis? Where are they located? What do they say? What neighborhoods were they in? And nobody could answer any of those questions for me. And so that is what sent me on this research quest that ultimately led to Mapping Prejudice, being a transdisciplinary public history, digital history project at the University of Minnesota. But so in the course of doing that research, I learned that racial covenants have been around since the 19th century. The earliest one that I have seen evidence of was in Massachusetts in the 1840s, but they weren't very prevalent. They started to be used more commonly, especially on the West Coast in the 1870s, to bar Asian people from buying property, and they worked in concert with other laws. They started appearing sort of in court records then, but it wasn't until really the early 20th century that they became ubiquitous. And what happened in the early 20th century is you have the professionalization of the real estate business, and you have a whole new class of different kinds of professionals, whether it's urban planners, academics like economists, and also real estate agents, who are all trying to figure out like what is the best scientific use of land. As part of that, there were a lot of ideas that came out of that movement. Things like separating residential and industrial uses in land use planning in urban areas.
Zoning.
Right. Having parks, having green space in cities, making sure that just thinking about like what should the street grid look like? What kind of light do people need? What kind of air do people need? To live in a healthy way. And one of the tenets of this new movement of urban planning in the early 20th century was that for neighborhoods to be stable and for property values to increase, they had to be racially homogenous. They could not be racially diverse. So you have, and most American cities at this moment are racially integrated, relatively racially integrated, that people of different races are living near one another. So racial covenants became heavily promoted by a variety of different institutions and entities, everything from, again, like newly professionalizing urban planners, real estate agents, real estate developers, and they became ubiquitous. They were entered into the property records of every American city, and they really started changing the way American cities were configured. And then, so this is about, this is the first decade of the 20th century that I'm talking about. So they became more and more popular. In the next 2 decades, during the 1920s, there was a real peak. During the 30s, there wasn't a lot of building, so there are fewer racial covenants. They really took off in the 1940s, and by the 1940s, most American cities were heavily segregated, in part because of the introduction of racial covenants. The other thing that happens in the 1930s is that the federal government gets into the real estate business heavily. There's a collapse of home ownership. People are losing their homes because of the global economic crisis, and the federal government spins up lots of new programs to support home ownership, lots of loan guarantees, as they are figuring out these loan guarantees, they have to write guidelines for what's the, where should we, what places are good investments? How should we be spending this money? And into those underwriting guidelines, they wrote that responsible developers needed to have racial covenants in place. And once that happened, racial covenants appeared in every community across the country, because there's no place in the country where there weren't some federally backed loans at some point in the 20th century. So that's basically the story of how racial covenants went from being, a somewhat they existed in the 19th century. They were used in some places. For instance, in Charlotte, they were very prevalent in the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. But then in the early 20th century, they really spread to every community across the country, especially in the North.
Okay. Wow. That's incredible to understand how that sort of thing like can really dictate how communities are built and how people are excluded and how hard it is for, for individuals like, even years later to live equitably, I guess, in communities.
Right.
So at this point, I think there are people who may not understand, whether it be from a position of privilege or a position of just, which is privilege, never having to think about it or worry about it because they identify as, as white. Or they are white. Sorry, I don't mean identify as, but, or present as white. So like, I guess I think a lot of people would say, why is this still an issue? I mean, you can't enforce them now, right? Like, I mean, we're desegregated. We, there's, equity or, why is it still an issue in your mind?
So we passed a law in 1968 that made racial covenants illegal everywhere in the country. Didn't that fix everything? So that's, and the answer is no. Just passing a law, making something a practice that had been very entrenched in every institution and had reshaped every American community, and created new patterns for the way people live and the way, the mechanisms that people have, the avenues people have for accumulating wealth. It's not solved by passing a law, just making that practice illegal, because the playing field, in 1968 is fundamentally uneven, right? And there has not been enough that has been done to try to even the playing field. So I'll just use give you a couple examples of how we're living with the legacies of racial covenants today. So we know in the United States that home ownership is one of the primary ways that American families amass wealth and pass wealth to the next generation. And so if you're like my family my grandparents were immigrants, but they were perceived to be white. And so they were able to buy a house in Minneapolis in the 1930s. 1940s, actually, that appreciated in value. It had a racial covenant on it, and it appreciated in value over the course of the decades that they lived in that house. And you would say, what does that have to do with me? Well, the house that my father grew up in, for instance, gave him as a child. His parents had not made it to 8th grade; they had dropped out in middle school. It gave him access to all kinds of amenities like park space. It was a great place to be a kid. There were really solid schools. He ended up not only graduating from high school, but going to college at the University of Minnesota because of all the amenities that he had growing up. And then, so that was obviously a very big shift for my family. But then when, my grandparents continued to live in this house. And when my grandfather died, my family sold the house and distributed all the proceeds to everyone in the family. And I was able to take my chunk of those proceeds and put a down payment on the house that I'm living in now in another part of Minneapolis. And so this is a very common story of this wealth, intergenerational wealth transfer, which is very much exacerbating racial disparities in home ownership. So that's one piece, that it's not that these policy decisions in the past, their implications, the effects, they reverberate through the generations, that the past is not really even past, right? So that's one piece. And then the work that we've been able to do with Mapping Prejudice in terms of creating very granular geospatial data around where racial covenants were, how many there were, when they were put in, has allowed us to collaborate with a lot of different kinds of researchers to see the patterns over time. So, for instance, one thing we were able to do with this data is we worked with two economists who established that a house in Minneapolis that had a racial covenant at any point, by 2019, that house was worth 15% more than an identical house in the same city that had never had a racial covenant. So it's that, again, like there's this wealth that covenants attracted investment. They help people generate wealth, and that has, continued to reverberate. And so we have a fundamentally unequal housing system, access to housing because of that intergenerational wealth transfer. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is that, again, because of this very granular data set in the maps that we've created, we can see that the patterns that were established by covenants have stayed in place. It's really astonishing that that more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act made covenants illegal, nobody even knows the covenants are in place, but the neighborhoods are so established as being racially homogenous, and there's all kinds of barriers that are not explicitly racist, but still exist. And so our hope with doing this research is that by making people aware of this history and making people helping people to understand and explore how these spaces came to be the way that they are, that by understanding how that's built, we can unbuild it. So seeing those patterns that have been sort of subsumed and seem invisible to, I think, our contemporary eyes, that helps us really figure out, like, okay, what do we need to do to repair the damage that was done in the past?
So is it about like finding the language and like correcting or removing those things too? Is that part of it?
Well, we as a project, we do not believe, we adamantly oppose any efforts to remove the language. Because we don't want people to erase history. We don't want people to say, oh, this never happened, right? So we have worked with legislators here, policymakers here in Minnesota, who crafted a law that made it possible for people to do what's called discharging a covenant. So it doesn't remove it from the property record, but it adds another piece of paper saying that this owner at this time renounces the sentiments of this racist deed. And for a lot of people, that's really important. But it's a personal decision whether or not there's no one forcing them to do that. I think that's really, and people have a wide variety of motivations and feelings about that. And I'm just glad that there is a legal remedy for people. But we've also found that's really important in terms of helping people understand what their personal connection is to this history. So otherwise, again, like I think there's so many things, so many issues that we learn about where it feels really overwhelming and immutable, and it feels like as individuals we can't do anything about it. And I think that this is one of those. And I think by helping people see, here's your personal relationship to this history, and here's one thing you can do. And we hope that will just be the first step. We hope that you'll use that to then broaden your engagement with trying to figure out how to make communities more inclusive and equitable. And we have really been inspired by a lot of the different initiatives that people have taken to do that work. Everything from really creative art installations in neighborhoods and neighborhood organizing, to support for affordable housing, to support for down payment assistance. So I think people are coming to the recognition more and more that we had an explicitly racist set of policies that kept people who are not white out of housing. And in order to repair that damage, we have to have solutions that are also that are attentive to race as well. That you can't have just a blanket sort of housing policy to that is race blind if you are going to repair explicitly racist, the work that was done by explicitly racist policies.
So where are you guys with the Mapping Prejudice Project? Are you focusing in certain areas? Like what is your kind of purview?
So we have, over the course, since we started this work in 2016, we have developed a set, some pretty sophisticated platforms for doing the work. We have both. So I think one of our, well, I'll just back up and say, until we began our work, the consensus, the scholarly consensus was that it was impossible to develop a comprehensive map of racial covenants, because what was involved was in that work was going through millions and millions of pages of property records to identify this language. There's no shortcut. So we were lucky that when we began the work in 2016, the Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is located, had just finished digitizing its property records, and that allowed us to. And they were very keen to work with us and to help us develop this methodology for finding these covenants. But they gave us copies of all the property records, and that allowed my colleagues to work with Python scripts and OCR, optical character recognition technology, to figure out a technical workflow for identifying these racial covenants. And then then once those records are identified, then we go to community members, and we use crowdsourcing and community involvement to say yes or no, this is a racial covenant or it's not a racial covenant. So in the course of doing that work, figuring out how to do that, we have developed a couple of very powerful platforms, both like the technical platform. We have a software application for looking through property records, which is a pretty specialized thing. And then we also have methodologies for community engagement, for figuring out how to work with volunteers, how for people to feel engaged and feel like they're, that it's a meaningful experience for them. And so we right now are both working to expand the map of racial covenants in Minnesota in particular, and then try to share these platforms with other communities that want to do this work. We're working with a group in Milwaukee. We're part of a coalition of dozens now of projects around the country that want to do this work. So after Minnesota passed its law, more than 20 other states have passed laws making it possible for people to discharge their racial covenants. And so that has prompted, there's demand all over the country to know what this data looks like in individual, in different communities. And so we are doing our best to develop our platform so that we can give them to these other projects and other communities that want to do this work. So we're hoping to keep this movement going, to keep powering this movement across the country, which is about connecting the past to the present and figuring out how past policy decisions continue to reverberate today, and coming up with constructive reparative solutions.
So how do you guys get funding?
That is a great question. It's a lot of work. So we get some funding from the University of Minnesota, but the vast majority of our funding comes from private foundations. We did get one grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was a huge transformative grant for us that really allowed us to build out a lot of our technical platforms. That's not enough to support our team. We have a tiny team, but still everybody needs to be paid. And so we've gotten a lot of funding from the Mellon Foundation and also local foundations here in Minnesota. But it is a challenge, is to figure out how to make the work sustainable. We also hope to have a more diverse revenue stream in the years to come, because there are a lot of our technical platform in particular is the most developed in the country, and as there is this increasing demand to have this information, we would like to use that technology in new communities, but we are trying to figure out if we can, how we can charge communities, to recover our costs, basically, in doing that work. So California, for instance, the state of California has passed a law that requires every county recorder in the state to identify their racial covenants. But they have provided no funding and no mechanism for doing this. And so we're in late stage negotiations with the county, Contra Costa County in California, to provide our technology for them and to figure out, okay, so what do we need to be sustainable partners in doing that? We're not a for-profit. We're the opposite of a for-profit entity, and there's a lot of for-profit vendors that are coming into the space, and we really we're a little worried about that because we want to make sure that the data is collected in a way that really makes it available down the road, that people are making high quality, accurate maps, and that we feel like the point of identifying these racial covenants is that we want people to know about them. So what's the best way to make the work transparent and accessible to as many people as possible? Because otherwise it's just another data set.
Yeah. I think about, obviously being in the land title industry, understanding like just how little transparency there is and how there is no single system for, property records and, that sort of thing. I think that's what makes title insurance so, important at this point, is just that there's no easy way, like a lot of counties and municipalities have digital records, but only back to a certain point. And so it's like, I think it makes this kind of like, I think this industry is uniquely situated to understand those challenges because they know what that's like, because they're in those records all the time. So how is it that people in the land title industry who are in records, and doing searches for title, what can they do to help out?
I think people in the land title industry already have and can continue to play a really key role in building political will for this kind of work. I mean, it's been very affirming to our team when we've had conversations with folks in the industry. Well, first I want to say, like, some of our biggest supporters and the people, we couldn't do this work without our collaborations with people who understand property records. Everyone from the recorders to the land title folks and to we have a amazing property records researcher, Penny Peterson, on our team. And, I think what you've just articulated is just how incredibly complicated land records are, right? And how unique they are. There's no standardization. And when we explain this to people, other researchers, they're like, well, you did one county, right? Like, it's all the same. Or can't we just use computers to do all this? And we're like, oh no, like you have, oh, that's nice, that you're so naive. But yeah, just like explaining like, oh, and sometimes they're handwritten and sometimes they're typed, and and there's not and they're like, wait a minute, there's not a standard form for all this. So just that level of expertise and understanding how this is, as you know, like, incredibly complicated. But again, like, I think it's been very affirming to me to go to different professional conferences in like surveyors or land title people who say, yeah, we see these covenants everywhere. This is not a weird, this is not a singular thing. And again, like, it's been very affirming to me to hear people who say work in rural parts of Minnesota say, I've seen these my whole career and I've always wondered what they are. And now you've given me a new way to understand land, race and land, right? That's really powerful coming from people who work in the industry. And those people are best situated to build political will for doing this work. So one of the hardest things sometimes for us is, this is not universally the case, but getting the records from county recorders who are reluctant to give us digitized property records. We have a whole sort of legal structure for memorandums of understanding for, respecting the records and other things, but people are still very reluctant. They're worried, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to call people out? Are we going to destroy the records? Are we going to create a separate title plant, that's going to be in competition with county recorders, or and none of those things are is part of what we're doing. So I think just being able to build a very strong and broad coalition of people who say, no, it's really important for us to understand this history. It really affects the way the industry works today, and just being supportive in every venue that you can be, I think is key.
What are there like specific, like, people could sign up to volunteer, to be
Oh,
part, to
yes,
say like, hey,
yes.
how could
Yeah.
they really get involved with this project?
Yeah, and that I would, I should have. I'm remiss. I should have said that from the beginning. We are volunteer powered, so we have worked with over 9,000 volunteers. We have so as I explained our technical process, we have a whole software application that takes digitized property records, identifies the one that seem to have racial covenants, and then we put them on a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And we work with volunteers in deliberate spaces to transcribe those records, and not transcribe the whole record, but find the racial covenant and extract the information that we need to put them on a map. And what we like to see is that people do this with people who they are in community with. So if you have a professional group that is interested in finding out more about this history, it's a great thing to do. Or you have a church group, or you have a book club, or you have a neighborhood group. So we run weekly Zoom volunteer sessions where my colleague Rebecca Gillette will walk volunteers through, here's how you do it, and here's how the platform works, and explain. You don't have to do that. We have a lot of resources on our website, like video training and other things. So a lot of people and especially people in this industry who understand how property records work, could probably just watch the videos and do it themselves. But yeah, we are expanding the number of counties that we're working in. We're going to be looking for volunteers, especially as we move into California in the next year. We're going to be doing a project in North Carolina, in Forsyth County, North Carolina, working with folks there. So yeah, volunteering, and you can find all the information about those volunteer sessions and all the resources for how to get involved on our website, which is www.mappingprejudice.edu. umn.edu, so the University of Minnesota.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to include those in the show notes.
Right.
I think my last question would be like, what would you hope that, like, this data collection, like, what would you hope that communities are able to do with it? Like, what is really the end goal?
So the end goal for me personally is I would love my children, who are now young adults, to come of age in a place where race does not, in a time where race does not determine your future prospects. So where we really are clear-eyed, I think, about structural racism and very, collectively come together to really dismantle those barriers. So that sounds like a really big thing, right? That's a big goal. But my hope with this, one of the reasons that we do this work is for people to feel this personal connection to this history, but not in a shaming, guilty kind of way. I want people to feel empowered by learning about this history, by understanding that it was just individual humans making these decisions, and we in this current day can make a different set of decisions that can really change the course of history. Yeah, so it's giving people a sense of like new possibilities, inspiring people to know that they can be powerful and take action, and that we can chart a different course, that we can disrupt some of these patterns that we have very consciously built over the years. That hope is not lost.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for sharing a little bit about it with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great treat.
If you want to learn more about the project and how you can get involved, visit the link in the podcast description. I want to share that the PropLogix team is going to be taking a little break from Title Talks to queue up some great content for you. In the meantime, we still have more than 60 great episodes for you to catch up on. Until next time, happy closings.